go to New South Wales opposition leader Chris Minns. He joins us live from a very chilly Cogra this morning. You look like you could be in the ski fields in that jacket, Chris Minns, but good to have you join us this morning. First of all, before we get to some key infrastructure issues in New South Wales at the moment, you've probably got an eye to what's just gone on in the federal election as the new ministers are sworn in today. Are there lessons from this election for you trying to win government in New South Wales?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not directly analogous, Laura. Obviously, every election is different, but we learn lessons from what the community's telling political leaders in New South Wales. We have to be responsive to the communities. We have to understand for fast-growing communities, particularly on the fringes of Sydney, they need the infrastructure to keep pace with the rising population. And that means schools, it means public transport, it means access to world-class hospitals. That's the challenge for state government, and that's one of the big lessons we've taken away from last fortnight's federal election campaign.
Yeah, well, infrastructure is always one of those issues that bubbles away at a state and federal level. Now we're starting to see this government in New South Wales talk about putting major projects on the back burner, look at smaller initiatives. Is that the right course of action?
Look, it's really curious that they've decided to make this decision, or at least announce it via Infrastructure New South Wales a couple of weeks after the federal election's over. It's almost as if they timed it to make sure the federal poll was out of the way before major cancellation to projects. I mean, there's two things to put into perspective. The first one is, at the last state election, the government promised the people of New South Wales that they could have it all, that they could accomplish all of their infrastructure projects, nothing would be cut and everything would be easy. Obviously, that's not the case. The second point here is that millions of people have made investment decisions about where they're going to live and raise their family, and now the government's changing the infrastructure pipeline without almost any warning. So there's real-world implications to these changes, and I think it shows that the government's prepared to say before an election that they'll accomplish everything, and I don't know whether it's worth the paper it's written on, Laura.
Well, OK, we're 10 months out from an election, though. You could give those residents some stability, as you say it, making decisions on where they want to live. So, as I say, 10 months out from an election, which major projects are you going to commit to?
Yeah, obviously we're examining those projects as we speak. We were more circumspect in the 2019 election. I thought it was curious that the then Premier told everybody in New South Wales that they could have it all, that they would in effect be able to accomplish all of their infrastructure projects, notwithstanding the fact that it was unclear what the revenue projections would be for the New South Wales government. We were unclear what the debt projections would be, and yet that was the commitment made. I think this really shows the limits of what the Liberal and National parties say when they go to election campaigns, because you have to be clear and believable when you go to those election campaigns. We'll examine the budget when it's handed down in a few weeks' time. Obviously, we'll make those decisions consistent with the growing western suburbs. That needs to be the priorities for political leaders in this state. OK, well, what can you name just one project that you would do that's different from what's already on the table and committed to by this government? Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, Laura, because we don't know what they've committed to. So far, in the last 24 hours, it looks like they've canned the Great Western Highway initiative. There's real question marks over Parramatta Light Rail Stage 2. The F6 has been completely abandoned. It looks like the Northern Beaches Tunnel is off the agenda as well. And we now know that the timelines for the metro projects through southwestern Sydney and into the western suburbs, the timeline on them may well be delayed, in addition to all the other things that have been cancelled. So you would appreciate that the opposition needs to examine the budget, work out what the government is going to proceed with, what they're going to cancel, and then make our promises before the next election. Any opposition that wins government from opposition, in effect, inherits a half-done jigsaw puzzle, and we need to do it consistent with what contracts have been signed and what the priorities are for Western Sydney in particular.
Yeah, you're rightly focused on Western Sydney. You say the government hasn't built enough public transport infrastructure there. So, I mean, back to that original question, really, can you name one project that is your priority for Western Sydney?
Look, obviously we're going to develop and release our infrastructure plan for Western Sydney, but you'd have to appreciate, I have to work out what projects the government's going to wiggle out of in the next few weeks before we announce our infrastructure plan for the West. We've got 10 months before the next state election. We'll do it with plenty of time for the voters in those communities to make that decision. But I obviously have to release our policies consistent with what is achievable and believable in terms of the forward estimates of the New South Wales budget. We're determined to do it, but there's a process that has to be followed in order for us to release our election policies and commitments.
I mean, there's a fair bit on the table here. Do you really, I mean, these have a long pipeline, a lot of these infrastructure projects. Do you really need to wait to the budget? I mean, you can tell us what your priorities are.
Well, I'll give you an example. If the government has decided to cancel or truncate Parramatta Light Rail Stage 2, that's obviously a very important infrastructure project for Western Sydney. Now, the last two elections, they promised that they'd build Parramatta Light Rail Stage 1 and Stage 2. The last election, they said it would be done no matter what. Straight after the poll was over, they cancelled it. Now, I suspect they're going to try and pull the same trick as we head into the budget in a couple of weeks' time. Now, that's an initiative that I think is important for Western Sydney and I'd be keen to support, but I need to work out what they're going to do in a few weeks' time before I release our policies. And I don't think that's unreasonable. I mean, we've got 10 months before the next state election. It's not as if it's next weekend. We'll develop our policies consistent with the needs of the growing western suburbs as well as what the budget can accommodate.
OK, just very quickly, does an Albanese government at a federal level make your life a bit easier?
Look, I'm really hopeful and optimistic about the new federal government. I think the last mob were in for a long time, and we've obviously had a state Liberal government and a federal Liberal government. I think a change is what the state has needed, and I think they've made a great start. So we're looking to work with them about providing the infrastructure for the fast-growing western suburbs of Sydney. As you know, there's going to be greater population growth in Western Sydney than the rest of New South Wales combined. They don't have an infrastructure to cope with the population today, let alone the future.
OK, we'll check in soon. Chris Minns, thanks so much for your time.